welcome to Round Robin. I'm Celine Guerrero with the City of Hampton. With us today we have the Hampton History Museum curator, Allen Hoilman, to tell us about an exciting new exhibit opening in January. And welcome, Allen.
Thank you, Celine. Yeah, we have opening in January, on January 21st to the public, a new exhibit that will feature three women who were instrumental in breaking down a lot of boundaries at NASA in the 40s and 50s.
And tell us about the name. I think the name is pretty catchy.
Yeah, When Computers Wore a Skirt. That's a quote actually from Katherine Johnson, who was one of the women featured in the exhibit. Before the age of electronic computers, which we're of course in the thick of now, which really began to evolve in the late 50s, early 60s. Computers were people.
Right.
They literally, using their mathematical skills and mechanical calculators, calculating machines, they did complex mathematical calculations that today we turn over to electronic computers. And so these computers were recruited, they were women. Women skilled mathematicians who joined this pool of computers that, interestingly enough, an engineer, who were nearly always men, could check out a computer and take back to their department with their calculating machines and do the complicated math to free the engineers to do more of the conceptual engineering work. So.
And this program started in the 1930s, is that correct?
It did.
And then it just grew.
Right. It started with a handful of 5 women in the mid-30s who were recruited to this pool, which was over on the old part of Langley's base, on the Air Force Base.
Okay.
And again, they established this pool, which grew from 5 to dozens to, by the time the program had ended and the women were dispersed around the rest of the base, had grown to the hundreds.
Wow.
So there was this pool of calculators, which an engineer could check out, have either assign calculations to them, or have them come actually physically join them in their labs and their offices. And it was a very successful program. It streamlined the work at Langley, made it much faster and much more efficient. The engineers themselves often remarked that everything was much more efficient. That the women computers could do the
computers is what they
language
call them, yeah.
The language at the time was a little less sensitive, but the girl computers could do the calculations much more efficiently than they could.
Oh, that's something.
So they very much integrated them into their work and depended on them. And they were very successful there. But in the 40s, in 1941 actually, President Roosevelt issued an executive order, 8802, which demanded that all federal workplaces hire without regard to race, religion, gender. Very progressive. Eleanor Roosevelt had pushed for it for a long time. Of course, NASA, NACA at the time, being a federal institution, they were then charged with being as inclusive as possible. So beginning in 1942, they began to tap into this wonderful wealth of talent that had previously been ignored of these black women who were mathematicians and highly skilled mathematicians, and began to hire them onto the base.
And what was the recruitment like in that time? Were they going out into the communities,
They
schools?
quite literally were. That recruiting is the right term. They went out to colleges, and this is how they got the first generation of calculators, computers as well.
Okay.
They went to colleges and universities. They tapped into their graduating classes. These were almost always very young women, right out of school. They went to they went to math departments, and do you have suggestions? They would ask a professor, who do you think? They went to schools around the country, because it was not only at Langley, but at other institutions. They were having the same program. And they were finding these folks who perhaps weren't quite living up to their potential. And then once that happened and it gained some momentum, the word began to get out in other more informal ways. And they began to recruit these folks in. Interestingly, when they started bringing in African-American women to work, they ran into a a difficulty. The state of Virginia had segregationist laws that
Right, I
were
was about to ask about
hard
that.
and fast. The federal government had given them a mandate to not be segregated. The state, so they were in a bind. The state laws did require segregation, so they actually established a separate but equal unit.
Okay.
And these were the African American women who were mathematicians that became known as the West Area computers. They were literally on a new part of the
Wow.
base that was separate physically from the East Area where the original office was.
Where everyone was. And now tell us about the exhibit. It's a traveling exhibit.
Yes.
And what can people expect to see there? Is it mostly about these women, or do we single out? There's three main women that we know
Yes,
about.
we're focusing in on three women who are featured in Margot Shetterly's book.
Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures. The book is
which
Hidden
is
Figures.
out already. So
And Margot
it's
is a
feature
good
film as well.
Hamptonian. And the reason we're featuring them, as was the same reason that she featured them, is they are Hampton women.
Right.
One woman, Mary Winston Jackson, grew up in Hampton, not far from here at all, in Old Hampton neighborhood. She went to school at the Phoenix School on Hampton University's campus and was the star pupil. She went on to Hampton University, where she got degrees in math and science. So she is a Hampton story. One of the women, Dorothy Vaughn, was working in Farmville, Virginia, as a teacher. A lot of the women they recruited, especially to the West Area computers, were teachers, because that was the profession that an African American woman could engage in if they went to college. She was a teacher at a prestigious African American school in Farmville called the Moton School. She wanted to do more. She wanted to put her math to work, and she moved to Hampton to take a job. This was in the 40s.
Wow.
She was one of the earliest women recruited in.
And she was brought on as, was she their supervisor?
She was brought on as a computer.
Okay.
And this was in 1942. And she was very successful and the most popular of the computers. She was the one that was asked for by name.
Wow.
But and the supervisors of the West Computing Unit were white women.
Okay.
Up until 1949, where Dorothy's skill with people and management, and of course her established expertise, she was elevated to be the supervisor of the unit. Where at that time she became the first black woman to ever be a department supervisor at the NACA.
I mean, these women definitely broke
They
a lot
did.
of barriers.
They broke all kinds of barriers. This was 1949. Virginia is deeply segregated at the time.
Right.
And the country, though their executive orders like 8802, didn't overcome that. It was one of the chips at the foundation of this thing. But didn't overcome it. But these women, by their skill and success, overcame those limitations, because what the engineers and scientists at Langley discovered was these were incredibly skilled minds, and they asked for them by name. They wanted these women doing their calculations because they trusted them.
Right, and there's a story about Katherine Johnson, who's another one of the women featured in this exhibit, and also from Hampton. There's a story that one of the, I can't remember which, was it John Glenn or?
Yes, Katherine joined in '53. She had also been a teacher.
Right.
And she was the best and the brightest of the minds. She had gone to West Virginia State College at the time, which was the historically black university for the state of West Virginia, and had excelled and surpassed all of their classwork.
That's incredible.
She was, in fact, when the state of West Virginia chose not to follow the other southern states in demanding their segregated universities, West Virginia decided to let's go ahead and do this very early. She was one of three African Americans recommended to be the first group to integrate West Virginia University, and she went there to study mathematics. She dropped out after her first semester because she'd gotten married and she wanted to start a family.
Wow.
So she taught school for another 10 or so years.
Okay.
She heard about the West Computing Unit. So she was hired on there in '53 and immediately showed her mettle. She was just an absolutely superior mind and was in high demand. She was only at the computing pool for 2 weeks before she was actually assigned to a permanent unit at Langley, where she did aerodynamic and aeronautical calculations for the unit there. But when we got into the space race, and
she was a big part of that.
She has a big part of that. The Sputnik in 57 threw the entire nation kind of in a tizzy because we didn't understand how the Russians could surpass us in any technology. So no effort was spared to get caught up. And she just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right mind. So she was kind of integral in how that got started. Project Mercury began. She did the calculations. Her mind was incredibly adept at figuring out kind of the mathematical geography, if you will. So she calculated the trajectories that these brand new rockets were going to take, which was brand new. This was a brand new field. There was no rocketry, there was no ballistics. She was kind of inventing it as she went along.
Gosh, that's
and so she calculated the trajectory of the first flights. But the story that's, I think, the most interesting, that really caught my attention, is by 62, electronic computers were now coming into use at NASA. And now we think of a computer as something the size of this table. They were room size, huge room size units that still required human beings to kind of manage and monitor. But they'd run the orbital trajectory for John Glenn's flight in Friendship 7 in 63. Well, he was preparing for the flight, and they were giving him the coordinates and showing him the trajectories. And he legendarily said, looked at them, and he didn't trust these new electronic computers, first of all. No one quite did. And he looked at them and said, well, get the girl to run the numbers. If she says they're okay, I'm good to go. And literally, she did. They gave her the same formulas that the computer had calculated. She went through them herself, determined that they were correct, and the rest is history. John Glenn was happy then to go up and give it a shot.
Isn't that's just such an amazing story. Every time I hear it, it's always just incredible that trust that they had in her and all these women. And this exhibit also ties into another exhibit that will be opening up, which you had mentioned. It's a 20th century exhibit.
One of the things we're embarking on is a kind of a broader revision of our 20th century gallery. When the museum was founded, a conscious decision was made to kind of stop in 1950. So we're going to bring it up to date and flesh out some of the stories that are very important. Like, we're sitting in a year with 3 monumental centennials. We have the centennial of the founding of the NACA, which is now NASA Langley. We have the centennial of the founding of Langley Field, which is now Langley Air Force Base. We have the centennial of the beginning of our entry into World War I. So we're trying to tie into these occasions. So we're going to bring our 20th century gallery up to speed, and we're starting, because of the centennial, with our stories about NASA, NACA, which became NASA, and Langley Field. So we're as soon as we have this exhibit under control and we have it ready for the public, I'm going to move directly on into doing a broader interpretation of the NACA and NASA that will include these wonderful women and their white counterparts, but also the whole scope of work.
There were hundreds of women.
There were hundreds of women at one time.
That's like the one thing that, I read parts of the book, the Hidden Figures book, and that was one thing that really astounded me. Like, there wasn't just these 3 women; it was hundreds and hundreds, and some, they still don't have,
They're still uncovering.
They're still uncovering all
names.
That, and that's just remarkable.
I believe that Margot will probably follow up her book with with an addendum that has because she says she's uncovering new names all the time.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And it was the title of her book, Hidden Figures, is so apt because these women were doing this groundbreaking work, highly sophisticated work, kind of behind the scenes.
Right.
You know,
Behind the scenes,
the
exactly.
folks who were getting all the attention at NACA and NASA were the engineers who were winning Collier trophies and the such, and astronauts who were rock stars
Right.
going into space.
Exactly.
And behind them were these women who were just incredibly
Pretty much running it. I mean,
incredibly
running the
powerful
numbers and-
minds who were doing the nuts and bolts work to make sure that it
Exactly.
succeeded.
Exactly. And now remind us again when the exhibit opens and how long, or since it is a traveling exhibit, it will be in other locations. So
Right.
explain that to us.
The exhibit opens to the public on January 21st. It will be in our 20th Century Gallery. It will include biographies of the three women. We do have a video, and I have not completed my work in this part of it, but I am seeking out some artifacts
Okay.
that we can also put on exhibit that will represent this story. We'll probably have it at the Hampton History Museum until late spring.
Okay.
And then we're working with our allies at the Conventions and Tourism Bureau to place it at other institutions where it might be a relevant story.
Yeah, it'd definitely
And it
be
is an
educational
inspiring
piece,
story, so
yeah.
it's relevant anywhere you go with it.
Exactly.
Schools, libraries, other museums. If you're a young woman who's looking for a role model, you cannot do better than the women
Definitely.
featured in this exhibit. Beautiful minds, successful. They were all, interestingly enough, when you read their stories, they were all so involved in the community. You know, they weren't these scientists sometimes have this reputation of being these cold, intellectual giants
Right.
who have a hard time communicating with the rest of the world. These women were integral in their community.
Right.
They were
I mean-
scoutmasters and church members and
And a big part of it is because they were educators, so they had that.
and very committed. That is a great point. They were very committed to passing it on to their next generation. One of the things that one of the women actually accomplished was late in her career. She stopped working took the opportunity to stop working as a computer and become a representative for women's affairs at NASA. And so she actually took a demotion so she could be an advocate for women
Wow.
at NASA. And that's how she finished her career.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it's going to be a very exciting and educational exhibit for everyone, people of all ages, and we're looking forward to it, and we're looking forward to the following exhibit in March that'll encompass all of the
Thank you.
important occasions. Thank you so
That's
much
good.
for being here.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
And
Quite
thank you
welcome.
for watching. We hope to see you at the exhibit, which opens January 21st.